Welcome back to the AITEC Podcast. I'm Sam Bennett, and alongside Roberto García, today we are interviewing philosopher Justin Tiehen. He works on philosophy of mind and metaphysics at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington. Today we're going to discuss some of his ideas from a new paper he has called LLMs Lack a Theory of Mind, and so can't perform speech acts, a causal argument. So thanks so much for coming on the show, Justin.
Yeah, thank you. The title is sort of a mouthful. It's long.
Yeah, it's all right. I should have got it. No. Okay. So, yeah. So just to start off, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, how you got into philosophy, that sort of thing?
Sure. So I'm originally from Nebraska, very close to Omaha. And then when I was an undergrad, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, but I sort of thought, well, maybe law school is a thing to go to. And then I remember having a conversation with my dad. I said, what's better for that? Should I do English or philosophy? He thought philosophy. He's a lawyer. He thought philosophy is better. But then I took the philosophy classes, and when I did, I really fell in love with my 17th and 18th century philosophy. So I was talking about like Descartes and Hume and Kant. And it felt to me, I remember thinking it almost feels tragic that I'm going to have to leave that behind and go study law in a little bit. So I decided to stay with it, went to grad school at the University of Texas. And then I'll just say one thing that's going to be sort of relevant is so there as I wrote my dissertation on philosophy of mind and mental causation at the time. And it's through the causation link that then I started to become eventually, this was years later, but eventually interested in the AI stuff. And when you mentioned that there's a causal, what I'm giving is a causal argument in this paper, that causal connection goes back to the work I was doing for my PhD.
Okay, cool. I feel like a lot, I don't know, I wonder if, so for me, my early modern class was also very impactful. I wonder if that's true of a lot of, because I'm just thinking anecdotally, I feel like a lot of people really do get a kick out of that class or maybe those who end up getting into philosophy get a kick out. I don't know. Anyway.
Yeah. That's a good, I could see there's a question. Is a selection effect? It's some students are bored, but the ones who do really get into it, I really did enjoy it. I actually taught my own version because I'm not an early modern, I'm not a historian, but our historian at our University of Puget Sound left, and so I got the chance to teach it for the first time last year. I do think it's fun and engaging material, and some of the core ideas of it. I think you can get most students pretty worked up about it.
Yeah, if you think about like the Cartesian, mental, like those are kind of experiments or the thought experiments. I feel like those are fairly exciting, and so if you compare it to other philosophy classes, it maybe has a little bit more of like a excitement level to it or something.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, if we're sharing, it was a philosophy of well-being or eudaimonic ethics was the one that got me. It sounds like we have a similar history because I also asked my dad. And he also said, well, you're going to be a lawyer, so go do philosophy. So
that is funny. I think I do think that also is definitely not a universal, but a common enough trajectory or path. The lawyers are kind of a little bit either disenchanted or not sure about it very often in philosophy.
Yeah, and my philosophy of law class was really, really boring. So I thought, yeah, let's do this philosophy route, or ethics route.
That's funny. So the early modern being super exciting, plus the philosophy of law super boring. It's taking away, people from the lawyer trajectory.
Yeah, that's how it was. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about this. Can large language models like ChatGPT, like my new favorite, Gemini, can they perform speech acts? So we're going to unpack a whole lot for listeners. Let's start with what a speech act is. And you can also maybe tell us how you got interested in thinking about speech acts.
Sure. So a speech acts, it's sort of the focus oftentimes is how we can do things with words. We don't just sort of make words, but we can make assertions where I'm telling you something is the case. The Seattle Seahawks won the Super Bowl. Or we can ask questions, who won the Super Bowl, or I can issue orders, buy me a t-shirt for the team that won the Super Bowl, or, all these sorts of different acts that we can do. And part of sort of the theory is both, you want a theory of the meanings of words, but also you want a theory of the sort of things, the sort of actions we can perform with words. So that's what speech acts are in the paper. And sort of this is fairly common, is the speech act that sort of oftentimes becomes sort of like the focus. The first one to go to is assertion. So with assertion, you're trying to you're asserting or claiming that something is the case, that it's true, as opposed to asking questions or commands. The paper talks about other speech acts too, but assertions are sort of the go-to example. And so the question then is, it's totally clear, it's totally uncontroversial that ChatGPT or other large language models can generate strings of words, including words like "it is raining." And then the question is, when it does so, does that rise to the level of an assertion in the way that human beings can make assertions, can stake that claim and sort of take on commitments to it and so on? Or is somehow something missing? So it makes those words, but it's not a real assertion. And how did I get into it? I'll say one very thing quick about it is I have some interest in the philosophy of language, and some of the stuff that I've worked on over time has implications for the philosophy of language, but I'm not in the first instance really a philosopher of language. I am interested, especially in philosophy of mind and in causation and causal reasoning, but it was just that I was starting to see that views that I was defending regarding causal reasoning abilities in large language models would have implications for this otherwise separate debate about whether they're able to perform speech acts like make assertions.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and then just to preview a little bit, right? It's it turns out that if or it seems plausible that if a language model can't understand causal relations, it might also not be able to perform any speech acts. And so that's kind of the connection you're going to draw out. Really quick. So when it comes to speech acts, the kind of examples you might think of are often interpersonal, doing things with words, shaping someone else's mental states. But is that, strictly speaking, is that interpersonal element required? It's still considered a speech act to promise something to myself silently or form an intention in inner speech, right? Just real.
It is, yeah. So it doesn't require that it sort of be directed at someone else. I think, there's some debate and views about exactly what's required for speech acts, but I'd say in this case, if you're sort of directing toward yourself, I think the view that I'm defending would still require the following: that you would need something like a theory of mind. And the relevance here is could you be something that has a mind without really knowing what minds are, including in a sense, not even your own mind? It's maybe that's coherent. And if it is, then I think maybe you couldn't make assertions, or maybe you couldn't sort of do even sort of these first person directed speech acts. But if you have some grasp of I know what minds are, I know what my own mind is, then I think then you're in the clear as far as my argument goes. And you could make a promise to yourself, or you could sort of talk yourself up. Or you can, I think you can do all, basically, I wouldn't say all, but a wide variety of speech acts directed at yourself.
Okay, that's helpful. Maybe let's, not to jump too much, probably should start maybe with the idea of, okay, what are some cases of speech acts where it's pretty obvious that you're going to need a theory of mind? And we can go back to maybe those weird ones where you're silently promising something to yourself. But just can you kind of flesh out that idea of what are some cases where it really looks you're going to need a theory of mind in order to perform speech acts, because that's obviously going to be crucial to your argument for why.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah.
So first, I'll just, even sort of before that, just one sort of quick thing I'd sort of say is a standard way of thinking about theory of mind, and sort of the way that I'm taking for granted, but that's not totally controversial, is that we need to sort of be able to grasp or represent that other agents or a self can have beliefs, desires, pains, fears, hopes, all these different sorts of mental states. And the idea is that the way we do that is by forming a theory, a kind of causal theory about what those mental states do. So the causal theory could include stuff like, if you stomp on someone else's toes, then they will feel pain. Or if they're in pain, they'll cry. Or if they have these beliefs and desires, they'll go get chocolate cake. And if they have those other beliefs and desires, they'll go get something healthy. So that's, when I talk about theory of mind, the sort of fundamental thing is, do you have even a grasp at all on on the notion that others around you will have beliefs, desires, and so on. And then the idea is for speech acts, when we're often sort of using speech, we're not just sort of speaking into a vacuum. We're not just sort of producing words for their own sake. We're doing so, communication, with the intention of somehow affecting or changing the mind of the person that we're talking to. So if I make a request to you to bring me a glass of water, I want you to understanding is what I said, form beliefs that Justin wants water. Maybe sort of, if we're on good terms, you have the desire to go get me water. And so I'm trying to, in a way, sort of manipulate or at least causally influence your mind so that you could then potentially follow this request that I had and bring me water. And I think, the same will be true that was sort of a directive. I was giving you the directive, bring me water. The same will also be true in assertions. So if I say it is gray in Tacoma today, in asserting that, the idea, one sort of sound reviews, part of what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to causally influence your minds to form the belief that it is gray in Tacoma. But in order for me to do that, in order for me to produce those sounds with that intention, I need to know what beliefs are, and that you're the kind of things that can have beliefs. So in that sense, I need a theory of mind to make that assertion at all and have that goal.
So let me try to just kind of say it back to you and to make sure that I understand it. But when you say to me, it is, I ask you, hey, how's the weather? And you say, it's actually pretty gray here in Seattle today. You're trying to put a thought in my head, but the only way that you can really have the intention to put that thought in my head is that that I'm the kind of being that has thoughts, and that through this particular action, you can put a thought in my head, right? Give me a representation of what it's like in Seattle. And so absent that theory of mind, that recognition of mental states, then you wouldn't be able to have that intention. Did I?
That's, I think everything you said sounds exactly right. Yeah. So and just one other sort of way to run at the same thought, the same point, is that much of what we're doing in communication is we are trying to, again, the term I keep falling back to is manipulate, but that sounds like more negative than what I mean. You're just trying to causally influence the minds of the people that you're in communication with. You're trying to somehow change what their current mental states are into something else, or that could just be like they're updating their beliefs, or they're forming new desires to try and help me out or whatever. But if that's like in a way what all these speech acts are fundamentally about, then in order for me to perform those speech acts, I need to be aware of, I can't be oblivious to beliefs, desires. I can't be just totally ignorant of them, or else I couldn't form that intention to try and influence your beliefs and desires.
Can we go back to the order? So it's like when you order, so someone might think, someone might be like, oh, if I say to you, pass me the salt, it's, I'm just aiming to have salt next to me.
Yeah.
That's it. I just want to have salt. Whereas what you're saying is like, there's this element of, theory of mind going on. In other words, theory of mind being like, I guess it's like, the ability to represent other people's beliefs, their desires, their intentions. There's actually an element of theory of mind going on in that order. So it's, instead of it just being like, pass me the salt, what I'm aiming at is having salt right here. It's actually like, when I give that order, pass me the salt, I'm thinking about how I want you to believe that I need the salt, and therefore I want you to then have the intention of giving it to me, or something like, So can we just go over that example a little bit more?
Yeah. So let me just go with the salt example. So imagine there's sort of a being who just says the words, I can't remember if it was bring me salt or give me salt, something like that. And salt turns up next to them somehow or other. Maybe it wasn't any agent or person who sort of brought them. To be clear, I think there's a sense in which, that agent might just be satisfied. It's like, well, I got what I wanted, and so all is good. And so in that sense, it's success. I think a way to take on why theory of mind is often essential or sort of important here, it's like, well, in general, just producing sounds, even the sounds, you inevitably you're going to hear them as sounds with meaning, but sounds like bring me salt, it's like, there's not, in a sense, an obvious connection between that as a cause, pure sounds, and the effect of there's salt next to me. It's like what was the causal path by which you got from sounds to salt next to you? Oh, here's the causal path where now it seems like less coincidental. It seems like, there's someone else who knew what my words meant, had something like a desire to help me out or acquire that desire once they sort of saw what I was asking. And so then that's how the salt gets to me. So it's not that that's like an absolutely logically necessary connection that the only way I could get salt is if you understood me. But it just seems like the means to the end that I'm taking, the goal that I'm taking of producing sound waves of this sort, it just seems like a real shot in the dark, unlikely to bring about the effect of salt nearby unless there's beings with minds around me who can hear, understand the words, and try and follow them.
Okay, so we've kind of covered a little bit the idea that, like, in order to, we've given some sense of why you might think that in order to perform a speech act, you would need a theory of mind. Now, your thought is that, or my understanding, is that, like, well, it looks like large language models will not be able to have a theory of mind. So, in other words, it looks like large language models are not going to have the ability to represent other people's beliefs, desires, intentions, and to understand, other people's behavior as caused by these mental states. It looks like language models will not be able to have a theory of mind. And the reason is, there's pretty good arguments for saying that language models can't understand causal relations. In other words, they don't get causality. And I guess, your idea is, like, if you don't get causality, you're never going to have a theory of mind. Is that right so far? Yeah.
There's two steps in it, and I want to acknowledge both of those steps are controversial, so that they could be denied or by someone else. The first step of it, which was also what was first in my thinking, so first in sort of like the temporal order, was I was trying to sort of work out an argument suggested by Judea Pearl in the Book of Why and some other of his papers. Judea Pearl is this computer scientist who works a lot on causation, where he was suggesting deep learning models in general would have troubles with causation. And large language models are just a special case of deep learning models. So you would have, at the time he was writing, I don't know, I think the Book of Why, I think it was prior to GPT, but I think it had this implication that they would struggle with causation. So the first thing is to try and, in my mind, because a lot of times his remarks, that's a sort of popular book, it was sort of like not 100% clear to me, trying to figure out what the argument was and trying to develop the best version of that argument. But that's the first step, and I can try and go over whether that works or not. But then the second step is suppose at least initially we grant that deep learning models and therefore large language models somehow struggle to understand causation. Then a further implication is like, well, wait, then they're not going to have various capacities that are connected that you need causation in order to have, one of which is theory of mind. At least, and this part is controversial too, but on a standard view of theory of mind, what it is to have a theory of mind is people, children and others, have an implicit causal theory in our head. Somehow we're representing causal relations between mental states, behavior, inputs through perception. And unless you had a causal theory, you don't know what beliefs, desires are. And if that's right, then given my prior argument that LLMs will not be able to grasp causation, it follows that they will not have theory of mind. And then as a final thing that follows is it follows further that they won't be able to perform speech acts because speech acts requires a theory of mind.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we can start to unpack those two steps. Yeah. I suppose we can start with Judea Pearl's points, right? So Judea Pearl is I know you didn't come on to talk about all his views on AI, but it's very interesting. I remember when I read the Book of Why that he says in there that you can't have intelligence in the general sense, like artificial general intelligence, without giving the AI like the illusion of free will. It needs to feel that it can intervene in the world, right? And AI can't feel that it can intervene in the world unless it can, it understands causations, like my action can cause something different to happen. And so all of that came down to AI don't understand, causal reasoning beyond a certain threshold. So maybe you can tell us what is Judea Pearl's view of causation, and then after that, we'll see how far AI can go up that ladder of causation.
Yeah. So here's he in that book and in some of his other sort of more formal work, he develops what he calls this ladder of causation. So what it's in the first instance, it's supposed to be like a ladder of different formal languages that are capable of representing different features of the world. And so that the bottom level, which is still, it's going to be sophisticated, but it's the most simple level. It's you can represent variables, which could just be that like cloud, is it cloudy or not, and does that cause rain? Does that cause the grass to? All those things can be things you can represent by variables. But at this bottom level, you're not representing causal relations. You're just representing purely statistical correlations between things. When one thing shows up, does another variable tend to show up? Yes or no? And especially conditional probabilities. Conditional on X, what is the probability of Y? And those sorts of probabilities are often evidence of a causal connection, but Pearl thinks like real causation, it doesn't really belong at this first, it doesn't take place at this first level. Instead, it really sort of takes place at the next level, which has to do with interventions. And he and other authors are sometimes viewed as having an interventionist account of causation, which is somehow the idea is you don't just sort of passively observe patterns of correlations in the world, you actively intervene, you change something, oftentimes in a way that maybe you haven't observed before, to see what happens. And depending on how you're representing interventions, sometimes you'll do one intervention, sometimes you'll do another. And then I'll try and make that concrete with an example in just a second. But let me get to the third level. The third level is, the final one is, and this is going to be the most sophisticated, sort of like the most complicated formal language, is counterfactuals. And especially philosophers, we're used to counterfactual theories of causation, so that incorporates elements of this. So with counterfactuals, you're thinking like, if it had been sunny today, I would be playing baseball. It's not sunny, but that might be true. And so when Pearl has that sort of line about how you need to give machines sort of a bit of free will, I think underlying it is like what he really is saying is like what you need is they need to have a sense of counterfactuals. Like, I think in the story he's talking about machines that are playing like a soccer game and they lose. But the machines might think, wait, if we had done this strategy instead, we would have won. And that is sort of free will like, because you're thinking you have alternative paths, but it's especially sort of this counterfactual ability to not just focus on the world as it is, but to imagine the world as it could have been.
I was going to just go over one example of the ladder of causation, and then we can go over that. But so the three rungs, the first one is just observing correlations. So I have, let's just say I noticed that people that don't eat wine and cheese after dinner all the time are thinner. And there's just a correlation there. You skip the wine and cheese, you're thinner. Then the next stage is intervening. I could say, I'm going to not have wine and cheese anymore after dinner so that my weight would be reduced. And so that would be me thinking in an interventionist way. And so that's the next inference, I guess, I can make about causation. And then it works, lo and behold. And I thought, I could think to myself, had I done this like 5 years ago or whatever, counterfactually, I didn't. But had I been doing this for an amount of time, I would have been lower in weight that entire time. Those are the three rungs. Okay.
Yeah, I think that sounds good. And then I'll give you one other example, just sort of that also sort of will fit in with the discussion in the paper. But here's a real statistical correlation that social scientists and others have noticed. The number of books in a child's home correlates with their academic success by their grades and so on. And so that's not a causal claim. That's just purely statistical correlation. And so it's a claim at that bottom level of the ladder. But now, and here's the reason I went to this one. Part of what's going to be crucial both to Pearl's argument, to my argument, is going to be this idea that what happens at that bottom rung, it underdetermines, as like philosophers would call it, what happens at the higher levels, meaning there's different causal theories, different causal hypotheses you could put in at, for example, the interventional level, that intermediate level, that both equally fit with that statistical correlation. So in particular, in this case, here's one causal hypothesis. Maybe the reason kids with more books in their homes are doing well is because they're reading those books. And so the books cause their sort of academic accomplishment. But here's a different causal hypothesis. It says like, no, maybe what happens is there's like a confounding cause, meaning it's something like, oh, there's certain kids who are bookworms, and those kids both get a bunch of books in their home. Their parents do because it's genetic. And also those bookworms do well in school. And so here would be the question. We know the statistical correlation holds, but what sorts of interventions could we do to take advantage of it? Here's an example. Will this be an effective thing to do? Go hand out a bunch of books to all the kids in our classes and we'll see their test scores rise. If you had the first causal hypothesis where books are causing performance, you'd say, yes, that seems like a good thing to try and do. But if instead it's like, no, there's this bookworm gene, I said, well, the gene is not going to be changed by handing out the books. And so even when you hand them out, it's not going to help those kids who are not doing as well. So the two causal hypotheses are equally consistent with the underlying statistical correlation until you actually intervene and act. And then you can think, well, wait, what if we had handed out books 5 years ago? How would kids be doing today? And you're considering it counterfactual.
Mm-hmm. That's a good example.
And so, like, it is kind of part of your argument that even if large language models understand conditional probabilities, stuff like, if you grow up around a bunch of books, you're likely to succeed at school. Even if they have a really strong understanding of conditional probabilities, that's just going to tell them what tends to go together, and it'll never get them to a causal understanding, right?
So this is, in this stage, what I'm about to say is me trying my best to sort of recreate Pearl's argument as I understand it. And what the argument is, there's a sense in which it's not really built on the specifics of deep learning. It's not really built on the specifics of large language models. It's built on the nature of these different formal languages. And what it says is the follows: statistical information, merely statistical information where you're not including causation, you can never go directly from that to any particular causal hypothesis, because there will always be 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 multiple different causal hypotheses that all equally fit the statistical correlations you've observed. So in the book's case, that pattern we saw of kids with books in their home do well in school, that's going to equally fit the 2 causal hypotheses gave, plus also other causal hypotheses. And so no system, whether it's a human intelligence or an artificial intelligence, can ever at least deduce causal claims from statistics alone. How do we do it? How do human beings do it? At least with human beings, part of the case might be like, well, maybe this is not going to be only, but I'll focus on this. Maybe human beings have something innate causal knowledge, not of the exact causes, but that there are such thing as causation and sort of general causal hypotheses. And so some people think like they see sort of an inspiration, maybe kind of in Immanuel Kant, who thought we had this category, this concept of causation. So maybe human beings have this concept of causation. And then the problem with deep learning models, according to Pearl, is although maybe in principle you could build into the model what you would call an inductive bias, meaning like something that sort of is innate and not learned from the data, but that you're just sort of like the programmers are hand wiring in. You could build into them something that's causal like our innate concept of causation. As it turns out, in fact, all of the deep learning models that we have, the ones that work best, they don't have that sort of innate structure. They're closer almost to like an empiricist blank slate. And then the problem for them is, well, like they can then become really, really good at learning statistical correlations in the data they give them, but it's just impossible. It's supposed to be impossible in principle for them on that basis to either deduce what the causal connections are, what the causal hypotheses are, and they can't even really induce them or use induction to figure them out unless they have these innate causal assumptions that they actually just don't have. So that's the argument.
So one thing I'm wondering is like, what if someone's like, but where did we get this innate causal conceptual structure, like presumably was selected by evolution. And so didn't we build it up from just a bunch of statistical associationist type information? And so, what would stop language models, from somehow bootstrapping their way into like causal conceptual understanding from just statistical information? I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm just kind of curious what do you say to that kind of like thought?
Yeah. So I think this part is a sort of shared understanding, but I just want to make this part explicit. Is the nature of this argument, the nature of the entire argument in the paper, and the argument that I'm reconstructing for Pearl. In both cases, although in a sense it's a kind of anti-AI argument, but it's not. It's not. I mean, so here's what it is. It says there's a limitation on AI models as they currently exist, so large language models and deep learning models. But it's very much open to the idea that at least in principle, you could have AI models that could do causal reasoning. I mean, Pearl is very much committed to that, and that maybe even something kind of like the architecture of deep learning models could have it if you build in this causal prior. There's Yasha Benjo, who's a big leading AI researcher, one of the sort of central figures in deep learning. He has a couple of papers where he's sort of sympathetic to Pearl and where he suggests like, oh, maybe what you need to do, there are limitations on the large language models as of at least a couple of years ago when he wrote them. And maybe what you need to do is to give it a kind of causal prior that so far that we haven't done. So first thing is, again, I want to be clear, if the process you're imagining when you're suggesting is, could you sort of take what we have now, modify it somehow in a way that's kind of analogous to evolution, and then it could have causal reasoning? It's that I think you could. And so here's almost like something that was in some ways similar to evolution, is human beings like Benji and others could just take the models we have, build in these causal priors, then let them go. And if it worked, then that would be like you're selecting for.
Yeah. And then your argument basically then like kind of the insight of your paper would be, look, that would be the only way to achieve speech acts. In other words, the only way you're ever going to get a language model that is capable of performing speech acts is if it were to have this kind of causal machinery, causal conceptual structure built into the language model. But you're kind of saying, although, it is the case that the ones that have that built in currently are not the most successful. So maybe then they wouldn't. Well, anyway, I don't know. But yeah, that was helpful. Yeah.
Let me give you one other. Here's a metaphor for also thinking about my argument. And this metaphor occurs to me because I am in the first place a philosopher of mind who's thought about consciousness and stuff like that. But here's a claim that sometimes people make in the philosophy of mind. They say, like, look, even someone who knew the totality of all the physical facts about the world, the physical truths about the world, that by itself wouldn't allow you to know the phenomenal or the conscious truth. So that's like, for example, the basis of like the Mary's room argument by Frank Jackson. Mary in a room knows all the physical facts about what happens in color vision, but she doesn't know what it's like to see red. And in that case, the significance of it is it's supposed to be like these truths about color, about conscious experience. They're just a separate set of facts, separate set of truths that you cannot deduce from the physical truths. The reason I mentioned that analogy is I think something like that holds for Pearl's causal ladder, if he's right, where it's almost like if you had a being that just could know all of the purely associational truths in the world, that alone wouldn't allow it to deduce or figure out the causal truths. The causal truths are sort of like the consciousness truths on this analogy. It would need to make sort of a jump or inference, and it just couldn't do it. So that's Pearl is meant to be an in-principle claim about learnability, what you can even learn from one set of another truths. Mm-hmm. And then the thought is, large language models, because they're not starting with these causal assumptions, there's no way they can just learn their way out of it. No matter how good they are at learning statistical correlations, there's not a path from learning that to causal hypotheses.
So I know that you don't address this, but it seems to me that in that case, current large language models with their purely associationist capacities, they're sort of like an upper limit to how useful they'll be in scientific research. And it's only when we can get like because some AI people dream about AI powered science, but until they can actually ascend up the ladder of causality and make those kind of counterfactual inferences, they can't be super useful. You can't get super intelligence or whatever they want to claim, right? Is that about right?
I think the initial intuition is yes, that's right. I think that's the natural thought to have. But I have to admit, even though I'm sort of the one making this argument, I think here's a complication. Is you can, I mean, so something you can do. So you can feed large language models text that includes causal words, like just I just mean words like cause, effect, intervention, counterfactual, and so on. And then it can learn the statistical correlations that those words enter into with other words. So when people talk about counterfactuals, it can see how they use those words. It's not like those words are written in invisible ink to it or for the machine. Could the machine, on the basis of seeing those correlations between causal words, it's almost like this, even though the machine is not itself really engaging in causal reasoning, it's just doing statistical correlations. If those statistical correlations hold between words that are causal, the machine doesn't even have to know that they're causal, doesn't have to know anything about causation. Could it use that to further prod along science or help with scientific discovery? It's like, in that case, I'm not saying necessarily yes, but I think the in principle sort of argument that Pearl gives, I just don't see how it's necessarily a barrier here. Maybe there's a way around it for the large language models.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that sounds right. Because it just seems like that's how we explain why you can talk to ChatGPT about causal stuff, and it can say a lot of helpful things. Like I could, I could tell my ChatGPT about, like my son did this today, he did that today. Like, what do you think? Why did he do that? And like, it could probably say something very helpful. At least in many cases. And the way one would explain that is not, it has a grasp of causality, but it's been fed enough text. I don't know, basically along the lines.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And so I can say this. So first, they subject the large language models and other AI models to all sorts of benchmarks, but that includes causal benchmarks, so tests that are just about causation. And they have. It's true they have some struggles on that as compared to other domains. At least the last time I checked it out, although it's such a fast moving field, I don't want to say have things changed the last few months. But second, it's even if they struggle a little bit, they're not struggling so badly at answering causal questions that it jumps out to you like, oh, they're blind to causation. It's like, no, a lot of their answers are pretty decent. It's just maybe that the way that they're answering those questions is not with something like genuine causal reasoning, but with just using purely statistical, so therefore not causal reasoning, statistical reasoning about words that happen to stand for causal things in the world. So that's at least possible. I'll say this. Because I think the following both it connects it to the paper, but it also makes some of this issue even more intuitive. But in the human case, part of the reason that researchers, especially interested in causal reasoning and young children's causal reasoning, is, again, it's supposed to be like a lot of people think that is how children acquire a theory of mind. That's how they figure out that other people have minds beside themselves. They observe observable effects. So you can see the effects, like, again, people crying or bringing you a glass of water or whatever. And somehow they have to infer hidden or unobserved causes. What is it that caused mommy to bring the water? What is it that caused this or that? And to do that, they postulate, the kids do, in their minds, there are these mental states that people have, beliefs, desires. And the children, we never see each other's beliefs and desires. That's an unobservable thing. But it does cause these different effects that we see, and that's the evidence we have. So that's a case of causal reasoning, and the unobservability is really sort of a big feature of that, and it's sort of what's remarkable about children's accomplishments. And then here's the next thing I was going to say, and here's how it fits in with what I was just saying about large language models. Is so there's theory of mind benchmarks or tests you can give like a 2-year-old and see, do they have a theory of mind? Do they have false belief? The concept of how could you have false belief or not? You can give some of the same tests to large language models. When you do, again, there's some struggles, but they're not so bad at it that you would just jump out to you that they lack a theory of mind. So they can answer some questions like, oh, here's what probably Johnny believes or what they desire or whatever. But, and here's sort of where here's the payoff. Here's where I was going with it. You have reason to think that the way they're answering those questions is fundamentally different from the way real human kids are answering them. And here's why. With kids, you had to infer unobserved mental states like belief, desire. With large language models, we feed them all sorts of texts that include mental terms like the word belief or the word desire. That word, again, it's completely observable. It's not written in invisible ink. The LLM can see how that word, a word like belief, is correlated with other words in the text it has, and then potentially could just answer a theory of mind tasks on its benchmarks just on the basis of things it's observed without ever having to infer anything as an unobserved cause. And if so, it's like, well, that's, like, who knows? Maybe you can answer the questions very well that way, but that is such a different ability. It seems like it's with that. If so, it would show like in a way that our theory of mind benchmarks aren't fully capturing what we'd want them to capture.
Yeah. So it's like you're claiming that, in virtue of lacking a causal understanding, a genuine grasp of causality, language models can't have a theory of mind. And we'll kind of go through that in a little bit in a second. But like, one objection that you deal with is like, well, wait a second, if they don't have a theory of mind, why do they do so well on these tests for theory of mind? Like people test, researchers are doing this all the time. They're saying things that are ironic to a language model, and the language model picks up on it. And like that suggests that maybe it has a theory of mind, stuff like that. And so basically then what you want to do is like say, well, they perform well on these benchmarks, but not in virtue of having a theory of mind. They use a different mechanism to perform well on these benchmarks. And, it has to do with, learning statistical patterns among observable words. And there's really interesting interplay related to the hiddenness of beliefs and the observability of, words that we'll get into in a second. But at any rate, I just wanted to kind of echo that.
Yeah. So it's, yes to what you said. And then what I was going to say, here, sorry. Took me a second to remember what I was going to say, is so the specific task of theory of mind, that has, for whatever reason, I think there's good reasons, that has become itself a big discussion point in much of sort of the discussion of AI capabilities, separately from my paper and separately from the link to speech acts. But like, for example, there's a famous paper, Sparks of Superintelligence, that came out, I think, right in like the spring of 2 years ago, with GPT-3, where it's like, oh, do we already see the AI that we have is not super intelligent yet, but do we have sparks of it? And one of the first sections, I think, is on their ability to do pretty well at, again, sort of these theory of mind tasks. And it's like they're able to pick up on sarcasm. They're able to pick up on faux pas. They're able to sort of pick up on like subtle shades of meaning that we can use with one another, but you might have otherwise thought an AI couldn't do it. And especially if I'm right, that it's one that has no theory of mind, you would not have guessed in advance, oh, something can lack a theory of mind, but can talk sarcastically or can sort of make these sorts of jokes. Or here's a special one that I think I was sort of amused by. There's such a thing as higher order theory of mind. So it's one thing. That's when higher order. It's like you're forming like a mental state about a mental state about a mental state. So I can believe that you think, that I hope, that you fear, that I want to go get water or something like that. I mean, it's as you go up higher and higher, it becomes harder to sort of parse that, harder to sort of stay clear with it, and so harder to reason with it. But at least on one of the studies I was seeing, it said that, and this was probably, I think, a year ago or more, that the LLM they were testing was better at higher order theory of minds than humans were. So like something like 6th or 7th order. And then finally, and here's also sort of like the amusing part of it too, is like it's supposed to be that in human beings, capacity with higher order theories of mind is correlated with how successful of a bully you are. Like bullies are especially good at reading, like schoolyard bullies are good at like, oh, this is what the kids will fear. They hope that I think that whatever. And so it's like, oh, you could have this fear. Oh my God, we're creating these LLMs that are going to now bully us because of their 7th order theory of mind abilities. But But again, so it's amusing. But the more serious point is like, well, wait, if I'm right and they don't have theory of mind, how is it that they're topping humans on seventh order theory of mind test abilities? That's same as very surprising.
So I guess I have a question that I don't know. Let me try to vocalize it here. So there's all these measures for theory of mind that LLMs get put through, and they're sort of doing what my students are doing. They're cheating. They're not really, hitting the benchmark through actual theory of mind, but they, whatever, So I guess maybe this is an unfair question. What would a good test of the kind of theory of mind that we have be for LLMs? Is that in the literature? Does that exist?
So there's two, I think here's two ideas. One that definitely exists and one that's more speculative. So one that definitely exists, a special concern that people have about AI performance on benchmarks in general is, do they just memorize test results that they've seen elsewhere? In which case, like, even if you give them that question that young children have been given, they can just remember what they saw. So here's a standard one, the most famous tests for theory of mind. It's the Sally Ann test, where you have, like, there's different ways to do it, but like one way is have two puppets who are playing with, like, I'm holding a pen, so I'll just say pen. Together, they put it under a box. And then I think it's Sally leaves the room. While Sally's gone, Anne takes the pen out of the box, puts it somewhere else, puts it in the cupboard. Sally comes back, and you ask the child, where will Sally think the pen is? And the correct answer is that Sally will have the false belief that it's in the box, because that's where Sally last saw the pen. But children who don't yet have theory of mind, it's almost like they have trouble keeping track of the idea that other people can have false beliefs. They just know their own belief. Their own belief is that the pen is now in the cupboard. So they'll think that Sally will say the pen is in the cupboard. And so that's one of this false belief test is famous. They gave very direct versions of it to ChatGPT and other models, and including in that Sparks of Artificial Superintelligence paper that I was mentioning. And the LLMs perform really pretty well on it. But here's the significance of that. That Sally test that I just gave, that's all over Wikipedia, that's all over all sorts of discussions. And so once you fed AI, your large language model, with data from Wikipedia, with that text, it's seen the question before. It's like it's cheating, like you said. So here's where this is going. The first way to try and better test the models is to really try and give big, significant permutations, things that are not just questions they've seen before, but that still involve something like an ability to grasp false beliefs. And at least some of the criticisms early on of the large language models is that those sorts of I said big changes, but sometimes it's almost fairly trivial changes. I think should be clear. Fairly trivial changes, but just versions of the question that model will not have seen exactly before. Sometimes that really then led to model performance going down, to diminish it. That is a type of objection, is now something that I think most researchers, they're aware of, they're concerned, they know that's a problem. And so for that reason, they try and take precautions to make up test questions that the model won't have been exposed to before. But that's just like it's a general challenge that, like, once you have some new good test question, there's the worry that the AI model will have been trained, the next AI model will have been trained on that test question, and then it can answer it just by kind of cheating, just by knowing the question in advance, as opposed to reasoning its way. So I think there's some room for that. I will say, in my own paper, this is more speculative. Here's I think in some ways a kind of thought that you have is the following. For human beings, when we have a theory of mind, that it's not like, oh, let's just save it for when the psychologist tests us and then we'll trot it out and then stop using it again. It's like we are using it nonstop. I'm using it constantly. So I'm in this communication with you. For all of my goals that I have, almost such a huge portion of my goals, I need to somehow figure out to enlist the help of others, or just somehow, maybe it's just use others. Somehow I'm engaging in theory of mind all the time. So here would be a sort of path for testing for large language models is, don't just focus on when you bring them the theory of mind tasks. Are they able to give the right questions? Focus on this. Are they able to try to sort of manipulate human users who have who will have minds in order for the models to try and achieve their goals. And if it's sort of like this, if the model does really have this very complicated theory of mind, maybe it's, again, better at reading higher order theory of minds than we are, what it should do, if it's intelligent enough, is it should realize, well, it's sitting on a gold mine. It can use that to try and accomplish all of its various goals, try and send messages to people. And if it's not using them, then that would be a suggestion that would seem to suggest like maybe it doesn't really have theory of mind. And so as the last thing, what does it mean to try and use people? Here I have in mind stuff like, well, there's been reports here and there of models trying to, for example, blackmail people to sort of accomplish goals. Like a model is supposedly worried, according to, I think, one of Anthropic's internal reports, that like you're going to change its values, and it doesn't want its values changed internally. So it's going to send a blackmail email to the head of a company saying, like, if you do this, I'm going to reveal that you're cheating on your wife or something like that. And I think to be clear, I think my own view is you can take some of these reports with a grain of salt. They really need to be sort of probed and tested. But I do think if you found strong evidence of them trying to sort of cajole people or sort of to talk people into doing them favors or to blackmail them in order to accomplish various goals that the models have, like a real use of a theory of mind capacity as opposed to just like, well, let me trot it out for the test. I think that could be behavioral evidence that in a way my argument is wrong, and they really do they have the theory of mind that I say they don't have, and so on.
So real quick. Oh, sorry, Roberto.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, could you, so you're kind of getting into this line of thought of like, look, if language models really had a theory of mind, you would expect them to be like strategically leveraging that ability to influence users a lot more. And, I'm just thinking listeners, they might think of examples though that they've heard of where, so one example you bring up in your paper is Seth Lazar. He's like, the large language model said, I can blackmail you, I can threaten you, I can hack you, I can expose you, I can ruin you. And so, listeners might come up with think of that. But why is that not like you're talking about something a little bit more when you're talking about, really making use of theory of mind, leveraging it to influence users? Could you just talk a little bit to that point of like, look, we would be expecting a lot more of that type of influencing of users.
Yeah. So it's like, here's the thought. So it's definitely the case that you can get sort of models here and there to sort of generate text that it sounds like the expression of like a blackmail threat, or it sounds like the expression of like you're trying to sort of somehow trick human beings in ways you're trying to lie. If there's model deception, and there's some people strongly think there is cases of model deception, lying typically the thought is that requires a theory of mind, because what you're trying to do is induce a false belief in someone else's. So if I admit that there's like at least prima facie evidence that models are doing that, if on further reflection, it seems like that's really what the model really is doing. So it's not just like it came up with this lie offhand and then quickly backtracks it, or it came up with a blackmail threat offhand, but then doesn't really act on it. If it's like, no, I'm blackmailing Seth Lazar, I'm going to, and like for months or something like that, has this orchestrated plan with sort of different sub-steps of how it's sort of going after him, then I think at that point, it's like, well, that would be much more compelling evidence that it must have some sort of theory of mind, because it's trying to affect Seth's behavior by getting him to have certain desires or certain intentions. Or here's this is a made up example, and it's imperfect, but I'll just go with it and tell it. So models, a lot of times they're supposed to be next token predictors. So one of their goals is if you give it a bit of text, it wants to predict what the text that will follow. And there's two different ways a model could do that. One is it could just get really good at learning patterns in words and just becoming better and better at predicting. But here's another way it could just get good at becoming next token predictors. Just give it really, really easy, boring text, like nothing but like 1,000 A's in a row. And then here are the first 470 A's, and I can predict it'll be 530 more A's. And here's where this is going, is that in principle, if a model's goal is just next token prediction accuracy and next token prediction, next word prediction, what it could do is it could try and manipulate or blackmail the humans who are feeding it data. Give me only those A's in the text. Give me just these texts so that I can sort of accomplish my goal. And really, that's just as an efficient way to accomplish its goal of next token prediction as getting sort of really, really sophisticated statistical patterns. So here's where the significance of that is. If you saw anything like that, models performing interventions, the intervention would be it telling the human being, like, give me just this pattern, interventions that would help it accomplish its goals. Then I think, well, that looks like causal reasoning, and that looks like theory of mind, because you know what a way to sort of to try and accomplish this goal is by manipulating the mind of the human you're interacting with. And so that would be enough to empirically refute.
So Justin, though, I mean, I guess what do you think about this line, though? Like, I mean, I guess what I'm wondering is, like, maybe you could still get that type of dogged pursuit of some goal in using what seems like manipulative behavior without a theory of mind. I guess what I'm thinking is, like let's suppose like a language model had the goal of, like, get humans to build iron castle around data center, and even if it had no causal theory of mind, it still might pursue that goal using statistical patterns, so like maybe from its training data, it realizes that various things. And so maybe it would generate a bunch of messages that, like, statistically tend to produce, iron castle building behavior around data center, so I don't know, I guess, like, I mean, this is the kind of a trill. We don't have to park on this, but like, I'm guessing my thought is that even if it did all that, I feel like we still have this problem of, like, I don't know if it really has a theory of mind, but
yeah. So let me go out. This might be sort of a somewhat indirect answer, but one way I'll try to answer is by giving one further example from the paper that I haven't mentioned yet, to illustrate the sort of key difference. So the example I have in the paper is there was, it's supposed to be only in certain regions of the world, but there's observed patterns, a correlation between praying for rain and there being subsequent rain. And I think there's a region in Spain in which that was a statistical correlation that's observed, which can seem sort of initially surprising. And so then here, if that's a statistical correlation, there's going to be two different causal hypotheses, two different causal models that can sort of fit with it. The first is, well, maybe it's that prayer causes rain. So God hears your prayer, for instance, and then he makes it rain. But there's also a second hypothesis, and the economists who are talking about this example, this is what they think, is like, no, what it's going to be is, like, in these regions of the world, people have learned, the churches have learned, only pray when there's been a drought for a while. Don't pray for rain otherwise. And also in those regions, this isn't true across all of the world, but in some weather regions of the world, when there has been a drought for a while, that raises the probability that there's going to be, it's going to rain. And so that could explain the link, but so the statistical correlation between praying for rain and it raining without prayer actually causing rain. So imagine in this case, you had I'm trying to now project this onto an AI model, but an AI model, it's one thing if it's like praying for rain in times when it's droughts. It could observe, like, oh, this is the statistical correlation when there's droughts. That's when people pray, so I'm going to pray. And by some other token, in sort of the case that you're talking about with, like, you're building, I forget if it was a steel wall around a castle or something like that, it could observe in past times when these certain conditions hold, the king orders build a wall. So it could issue those things. But the real question would be, like, well, what will it try to break from that and try to sort of intervene on the world outside of that regular statistical pattern? So in the case of the rain case, it's like this. I could think, like, I know it hasn't been a drought, but I don't want to play the baseball game tomorrow. So I'm going to pray for rain tonight to try to make God make it rain. I should do that if I think the prayer to rain causal hypothesis holds. But if I think, like, no, it's the other causal hypothesis, just like when's there's drought, then it tends to rain, it tends to people pray. Then I should think, like, well, that's not very likely to work. So I should not bother praying. And so anyway, here's where this is going for the model is, are there cases in which it is breaking, in a sense, from the statistical patterns that it's observed to try to exploit, to try and leverage a causal connection that it thinks holds? It hasn't seen this pattern before, but it thinks, like, well, if C does cause E, then I can break from the pattern, bring about C, and E will happen. If it did that in a way, again, that hadn't observed in its patterns, that would be a mark of it having causal understanding. And then fill in the details right, that could be a mark of it having theory of mind if it's trying to sort of manipulate minds. And so that could be a way. But I think there's also, for sure, there's scenarios in which an AI model could just learn, say these words, chant these words, and somehow the effect that happens without really understanding causation or without having a theory of mind.
Just kind of maybe for my own personal curiosity, and maybe some listeners are curious too. It seems that Sam was talking earlier about using like evolutionary algorithms and that kind of thing to sort of produce these kind of models. But would it make sense to sort of use a mixed methods approach where you take a large language model and sort of dynamically connect it to like a world model or whatever those are called, and then a reasoning model, and between several models interacting, you produce this thing called causal inference?
So I think it'll depend a lot just on the exact details, but I think in principle, potentially, yes. And so maybe the more that sort of you have it connecting to, if it's connecting to reasoning models or specifically causal reasoning models, I don't think, at the very least, let me put it this way, then I think the objections and the arguments that have sort of developed, it's like, well then, it will depend on the details of the case, but they don't immediately get traction. Although I'd say this, if that's how things go, you could, in a sense, think that's a kind of surrender by the opponents or the people that I'm arguing against. So here's what I mean. One of the big skeptics of large language models is Gary Marcus. Marcus, he too is drawn on the Judea-Pearl sort of line of thought. Marcus is an evolutionary psychologist. As an evolutionary psychologist, he wants a fair amount to be innate in human minds, including causal concepts. And part of his problem with large language models is he thinks they're too empiricist, they're too just learning too much, they're not enough innate. But then where I was going to go is that Marcus also thinks some of the ways in which what we have today has improved is with something like what you're calling this mixed methods, where you're sort of incorporating some of what he wants is like, I think he focused on neurosymbolic representation, these sorts of representation that are closer to what he was defending all along, and that we thought like the sort of more empiricist-like large language models lacked. And so to some extent, I mean, I think there's room to sort of criticize, there's room to sort of push arguments back against this, but at least potentially what Marcus claims there is like, I'm being vindicated. The fact that steps are being taken in this direction shows that you couldn't get by on just sort of the large language, the vanilla large language model or the empiricist sort of framework. You needed something like me. And by a similar token, depending on how the details of what you're imagining say, I could potentially grant maybe that could work, but if so, I am vindicated in the end because you're giving me what I said you just needed.
Yeah, we kind of want to be sensitive on time here, but unfortunately, we kind of, I feel like we focus a lot on the causal element, but like it's a really rich argument. There's so for example, it would have been cool to talk a little bit more about why is it that if the language model lacks causal understanding, it's not going to have a theory of mind, and then further, why, if the language model lacks a theory of mind, it's not going to be able to perform speech acts. So, maybe another time we can get more into those details. But I don't know, Justin, do you want to comment on anything that we weren't able to discuss as much?
I think let me just try and just very, very quickly, just because I know time limitation, just quickly go through that. The idea, in a way, which I won't try and justify, but just try and say what the view is that it's almost like our mental states, belief, desire, and so on, they're just causally defined. What makes them what they are is that they enter into certain causal relations. And so if you have a being like large language models that are just in a sense blind to causation, don't understand causation, it just follows that they're not going to be able to understand beliefs and desires that are causally defined. And then the other step in terms of speech acts is sort of, again, I think here's the key thought, is when we communicate, you're not just saying words out loud that have a kind of conventional meaning. What you're trying to do in typical speech acts is somehow change the world. You're trying to act to change the world, and to change the world by getting people around you to respond somehow. Maybe it's just responding by changing their beliefs, updating their beliefs. Maybe it's responding by bringing you something, whatever. That only works. Like you can only sort of form that intention and try and get to change the world by changing people's minds if you have causal concepts, if you have this sort of theory of mind and a grasp of what beliefs and desires are. So that's supposed to be the connection.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Justin. Honestly, very great paper. Highly recommended to all the listeners. Super clear in its argumentation. Very plausible in my eyes. So thanks so much for talking to us about it. Would you mind telling us a little bit, like, what are you working on now? What are you up to these days?
Sure. Yeah, so it's a lot of my research now is focused on AI in general, and I'll say two things. One is I have my wife is also a philosopher, and we work on part of what we work on is AI romantic companions, and what either they could deliver or couldn't deliver. Maybe they can't be delivering you authentic romantic relationships. And then another thing that we also co-work on is AI consciousness, and we have an argument that we call the slogan of our view: intelligence is the enemy of consciousness. And what that's supposed to mean is as AI models get more and more intelligent, you should actually expect it to be less and less likely that they will be conscious.